Welcome to the first lecture of entrepreneurship research about social network analysis in this year. Social network analysis has been developing to a very dominant research disciplines in almost all scientific subjects. It developed in the 17th, 18th century in mathematics, matrix algebra, and a lot of calculations were developed. The first application actually in social science were some larger studies, Hawthorne experiments, Marienthal experiments, and the first sociogram was presented from Professor Moreno in New York in 1933. Then it developed in psychology, it developed in other social sciences, also in innovation and entrepreneurship in the 70s and 80s. And nowadays, I would guess almost half of all publications have something to do with social networks and social network analytics. Next to that, it developed in many other disciplines from physics, chemistry, biology. So it's something you should know as students. It's something which is actually quite important when you study innovation, innovation management, entrepreneurship, and sustainability. When we have a short look at the social science disciplines, we can see the network analytics developed from math. That's centuries ago, and it's still developing. But also in statistics, social network analytics can be distinguished from other statistics because not the individual in social science is the smallest element. It can also be dyadic relationships or triadic relationships, but also subgroups. And you have social network analytics in political science, for instance, in predicting decisions between unions and employers, or predicting political decisions at the European Union. You have social network analytics in anthropology by studying networks of tribes or social developments over time. You have them in sociology by, for instance, studying nowadays crowd movements, or instant gatherings of people and behavior. You have some in psychology because people are influenced by other people's, by peers. So social networks are also influential, but also can be used for influencing people online and offline. You have them in organization and innovation management and research. As we will come into this lectures very detailed to some aspects out of it. You have some epidemiology as we have this COVID-19 pandemic situation nowadays. I mean, a virus spreads in social networks, knowing the social networks and knowing how not only innovation or information spreads or viruses spread. There's the same mechanism behind it, there's the same social network behind it, so it's also a social science discipline studying that, and also in linguistics. Languages develop socially to some families of languages, to Germanic languages, where actually Dutch is the oldest still existing language, and English, German, and the Scandinavian languages developed from that. And that happens also in other languages. There are three textbooks I would suggest. They are 30 years old, but about social network analytics, as with a lot of things in mathematics or statistics, they are not really rapid changes or developments. These textbooks are very good written. I have read all three of them, and I also can suggest taking one of them as a grounded base for studying social networks and using them in social network analytics. What is a network? A social network is something on humans. So actually the nodes in social networks are individuals, humans. And what is between the nodes, that can really differ. It can be like the transfer of communication information as I do it now. It could be kinship between two individuals. It could be friendship. It could be a personal relationship. It could be advice. So there are many, many things between two persons that can be the line between this, the ties between these nodes. And as I already explained, the smallest element of social networks has not to be the individual. It can also be a dyadic relationship. It can be a triadic relationship. It can even be smaller groups. Social networks can be displayed in a hierarchical structure, from the individual being a part of a larger group, being a part of even a larger group, taking an organization, taking the individual, being a part of a team. The team is part of an apartment. The apartment is part of a larger organization. The larger organization is part of a association in a branch. So actually there's a hierarchy in social networks that can be displayed, analyzed, and it should also be considered. What's between the lines, as I already said, it can be kinship, it can be a work relationship or a social relationship. It can also be affiliations, physically near or being in the same class, doing the same model at your university. It can be trust, friendship. So many things can be between. So you can analyze at the same time with the same people very, very different things. As done in this example, I mean, we all know that. Star Wars. So in Star Wars, it's just displayed here as a set of notes that are the individuals, the actors in this movie, or the roles, characters in this movie, and the relationship of different kinds between this. And you see that the most central person, obviously Luke Skywalker, has many different lines to other actors, and that shows that the notes are not exchangeable, but the lines we study and we put into research are really distinguishable from each other. Taking something about literature, it's the same. The network is different. I will come to those aspects in a few minutes. But you also see that there is a structural aspect. You have these different lines, of course, but you also have some structural aspects as being central, being in a dense subnetwork, being between subnetworks, being isolated or being very peripheral in a network. So that all says something and might explain behavior, might explain outcomes of networks, might help to also manage networks, to manage your own or to manage a startup, to position your startup somewhere. What we know is that it almost doesn't matter what network you consider. If you take the World Wide Web, or you take a network of your peers around you, you take a network of students at your university, at your football club, you can take a network. A general structure always appears that people tend to cluster in groups, and these groups are loosely connected to each other. And there are some people in between that are bridges or brokers, as they are labeled, that are people that are between groups. But networks can be very different. Here we have Hamlet as a network, and here we have the external board member network of the Dutch companies. That's not very new. That's, I think, 15, 20 years old. Every company has an internal board, that is CEO, CFO, and so on, and the external board of members. And in the external board, there's a tendency that members of external boards are not only part of one board, but of several boards. In 2005, that was restricted to in the European Union, that you only can be part of 5 different external boards, and some people are. And if you are in some external boards, of course, there is the interlink between companies, and that's displayed here. So you see that one bank, the largest bank in the Netherlands, ABN AMRO, has several members, actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 members that are also part of other companies in an external board. And this interlocking directorates, as they are labeled scientifically, also say something about a structure of economy or a structure of companies inside countries. And there are differences between countries. In France and Germany, these interlocking directorates are rather dense. In the United States or Great Britain or even Scandinavia, these interlocking directorates are not as dense. And if you study them over time, that also have effects on a strategic direction of companies, on survival rates, on the behavior in crisis. So if companies cooperate more or less by having interlocking directorates, the behavior of companies will be different and the information companies get from each other will be very different. So again, important is that social networks always have a hierarchy. You have the individual as a lowest possible element in social networks. This individual ties up with other individuals. These individuals tie up as group with other individuals. And then you have a hierarchy from individual, team, department, organization, association, country, and so on. So you always have to consider a hierarchy in networks that works on both sides. The individual shapes the network upwards, and of course the individual is influenced by a network downwards. Another important features of social networks is dichotomous and valued. Dichotomous means that the line between two nodes, between two individuals, can only be 0 or 1. So either there is a kinship, I am the father of or brother of or sister of someone, that there or it isn't. There is no scale, no dimension behind it. It's on or off. The same might be friendship or trust, if measured in on or off. That's a matter of definition and measuring that. But for instance, how much people communicate, it's more or less a scale. And a scale is a valued network. From a mathematical point, dichotomous networks, or if you have only the state 0 or 1, are much easier to handle than valued networks, but most networks you study or studied in research are valued networks. Another, as you can see here, we will come to another dimension, dichotomous networks of friends, where people were asked, who's your friend? They indicated, and then there's a line or no line. It's, by the way, very sensitive questions because the definition of friendship, it's very different among people. Most people see it as some emotional bond between two persons or more persons. That's true. In this definition, we have applied it here. It's where we were asking people, with whom do you also do activities outside of your work context? That's a very, very weak, light definition of friendship in this case. But then you really have a 0 or no, either you do or not, and then you have a dichotomous relationship. That's the communication network, where you also can say, how many times do you talk to one person a week? And it can go from whatever, 0 to 100. And then you actually have a valued network where the lines get a value. It's like a ordinal, sometimes even metric scale. Another dimension is whether a network is directed or non-directed. Coming back to the question of friendship, I could ask a group of people who is your friend, or whom do you consider as friend? And they could say that, and I could ask the friend whether the person who is supposed to be the friend also considers that in the same way, but that must not be the case. So it could be one-directed, that one is saying, that's my friend, but the friend, or the supposed friend, is not saying it's the same. So in this way, a lot of things are directed. When I ask someone, do you trust this person? Then it could be that the person says, I trust this person, but the other person says, no. And that are directed and undirected relationships. If it is a question which only can be both-sided, like kinship, then it is an undirected relationship, and there is nothing else possible. When it is a relationship which can be two-sided, either in a scale, how much you communicate, and it differs, you get two different indications of something which subjectively is indicated by persons. As you see it here, you could also weight that. But here, when you see arrows in a sociogram, it's always a directed relationship, and there's something behind it, because the people could answer differently on different questions. The next very tricky issue in social network analytics is, what's your population? I was researching school classes once, and a school class is a nice empirical setting because there are 25 children, and I was recording it with a camera and was actually using questionnaires, and I can actually measure the network of the school class, but the network of these kids does not end at the borders of the school class. The social network goes beyond that. And that's true with all social networks. So actually having a measurable population, it's much more difficult than with classical research, because a social network does not have real edges or boundaries around. And that's a very tricky thing why you have to think about as researchers where you see or set these boundaries, because that's the thing you have to argue when you do research, why it makes sense to actually have these boundaries. If that is a group of people which is clearly distinguishable from other groups, it is not perfect because the network goes beyond that, but you could really argue for that in setting the boundaries there. But for many, many things it gets more and more difficult to study and to really define your population, because if you do not define a population, it gets even harder to define a sample. It's really a hard job in social network analytics, getting the right thing if you want to use statistics from population to sample. If you just illustrate or use social network analytics for illustration, it's fine, you don't need that, you don't have these requirements, but if you do statistics with it, you have these requirements. That also counts for sampling. I mean, if I set students in Berlin and I say, okay, that's my population, and I do the sampling, I go into 3 faculties from 3 different universities. It could be a kind of sampling, and I take all students. Still, you miss the network contacts outside those faculties, and if you define the population, you miss the network contacts outside the university context of the students. Students do now more than other students. Process of data collection. Most data are nowadays actually collected electronically. As with most research, a questionnaire is not the method of the first choice anymore. If not an electronic questionnaire, you can ask people about friends and whatever networks. That's one possibility. Other possibility is to use algorithm to extract data from the World Wide Web, from social networks, whatever kind, from blogs. That's the method most people use nowadays. Also going into documentations, going into archives to get data and transforming them into network data. That's something to do. As I said, in social network analytics, you have the individual, but you also could take as lowest element dyads. So if 2 people trust each other, you could taking all trusting triads in an organization and take that as an analytic element, and also with triads. Well, I said, you have web mining, you have big data analytics, so you go into the World Wide Web, you go into the large data files and documentations. What also comes up is observation. I have done it with recordings at schools. We do it now with recordings on working conditions. So there are many, many examples where you can use photos or recorded movies to actually put them into networks. You have archives, and you can do social network analytics using questionnaires. Actually, when you use that's one example, when you use a simple questionnaire, you can just do that with this matrix. You have the people on the one side, and that's how much they communicate, and they just indicate. That works for smaller groups. With larger groups, it wouldn't work. But still, it is a method which has some disadvantages, because people, of course, have difficulties to remember or to indicate it right, and you can only measure specific networks. So actually, to have more accurate data, going into documents, archives, or World Wide Web, big data. It's a preferable method. Questionnaires, in questionnaires, the most mistakes are done. Still, for decades, it was the most prominent method in social network analytics. Then you have other issues. Networks evolve over time, but not much as we think. You see that acquisition and mergers, that networks are extremely stable, but still longitudinal research makes always sense also in social network analytics. Informant accuracy, what I said, to recall your own social network or social network of others is difficult, and you make mistakes in that. You have, of course, questions, as with all research, validity, reliability. You have a big issue if you want to capture full networks with missing data, because a lot of ties are instantly missing if you miss information of someone. So you have different imputation methods. It goes too far explaining that here, but you should know there are methods of dealing with missing data in social network analytics, but there are really different two methods in classical statistics. And of course, you have some ethical issues here. Just takes a question about friendship. It's interpreted in different ways, and it is a sensitive topic. Also, social relationships as a general theme is a very sensitive topic. So also indicating who's your friend, whom is close to you, or who are your resources in your social network. So you have to deal with ethical issues in doing social network analytics more than in other research. And you should take this serious, because otherwise people won't give you the information you need for your research. You have to be very sensitive going this way. So, but if we once have data, and let's say that's a friendship data, that are undirected data, all have filled it in, I have made a matrix out of it, and easily I can make a picture out of it. And out of this picture, it's a sociogram. I could calculate some configurations as an entire network or some positions of people in a network. I could derive some conclusions from about their behavior. Causality is a topic always. If someone is positioned because he has a certain behavior, or does the behavior result out of a certain positioning? That's something that cannot be really clarified unless you do really longitudinal research. But here you have a network, and then we could look at different positions where I don't want to go into all positions. Of course, you have triads, but very important in network calculation is, for instance, the geodesic distance. That's the shortest distance between 2 points. What's the shortest distance between F and G? That's important because if people are high in the shortest distance to many, many people, they are provided with information and control benefits. And that has implication for their functioning, for their behavior. And therefore, geodesic distance is often used in calculations in determining social network positions. For instance, if you look at centrality, at the first glance, you would say that Diane is the most central actor here. Of course, she has the most ties. She's very central in a subgroup. But if you take the geodesic distance and calculate the shortest distances to all actors, we will come up that Heather actually is closest to all other actors. So in terms of getting the right information, getting a diverse set of information, having the most control, Heather is central, much more central than Diane. And considering centrality, you have many, many more measures. Closeness indicated here, it's a mixture of both, but there are many, many more. And in this way, you have to consider centrality from very, very different perspectives, not only from a perspective being central in one subgroup. That also shows the example between centrality developed by Freeman in the late 70s. That's the concept here, very similar. Structural holes developed by Ronald Burt in the early 19th. And he's claiming, yeah, if you have a lot of contacts into the same group, then you have a lot of redundant information, because within a group, always the same information is circulating. That's not efficient, it's not effective. When we reconfigure your network, as you see it here in network C, you have 4 contacts and you have the same amount of information, but much more control. So you reduce redundancy in your personal network, your network gets more efficient and effective, and that's what he labels structural holes. You optimize your network for structural holes. And empirical research has massively shown for startups, but also for individuals, that you're on a professional way, you're much more successful if your network is full of structural holes, or in other words, very efficient and effective. When we go to scientific journals, to the maybe most important journals in innovation management, you see that if I put it into Google Scholar, I get a lot of references, and that also shows that many publications are done using social networks as term and really researching it. There is no way around anymore. It doesn't matter what you do later. If you are a product manager, or if you are responsible for business development or research and product development, you need to know the effects of social networks. What marketing means, you need to crowdsource IDs, test IDs. You have to deal with larger amount of people, with crowds, and you have to understand these crowds online and offline. And that means that you have to have an understanding about social network analytics. When you are really in an analytic job in science or as data analyst, you will need it anyway, because that's one method of getting information out of a lot of data, in actually reducing data mining to a point that you have sense-making information out of many data points, many individuals that are interlinked in certain ways. But not only in social science, but also in biology. What you see here, it's a yeast cell up there, a protein network of a yeast cell. And at the end of the day, it doesn't look any different than a social network. Networks always look the same. It doesn't matter what networks you take, brain cells, yeast cells, or yeast proteins, or literature. That's a human network, of course, Star Wars saga, or you take a network from chemistry. So analytic and structural determinants behind are the same. There is no different. So as someone who is able to analyze social networks, you would be able to analyze every kind of networks. As done here, I mean, it unluckily was done after the terrorist attack of the United States, but also this terrorist network can be analyzed as a social network. It is a social network. And I remember this time when at many conferences people from security services came to learn and understand how social networks work. And if you look at that, and if we come back to betweenness and degree, actually different people in the terrorist network had a high degree, being really dominant in a subgroup, or being in between, being actually the guy who has the most information and the most control in this network. So in fighting them, we have to understand the functioning of social networks, and that means that we are able to analyze and study them. There are 2 generic structures. The term we often use in literature and scientific publication is social capital. There is something as social capital, but social capital can be very different things. It could mean when you are, or not older age, but taking the example, you're getting older, and you have a close group of friends where you are embedded. It makes you having a nice life. It makes you happy. It makes you someone for support, for talking to, for going out, for going on holiday with. It actually increases your life expectancy much more than eating healthy or doing sports. So that's a very important aspect. That's social capital, but at the same time, as I showed you with the structural holes, also efficiency and activity is a kind of social capital which might make you professionally successful. And both are contrasts. The one is different to the other one. So social capital results out of your social networks in very different things. And there's also something as social liability. That means the social network can also have a negative effect on your professional success or on your well-being. As in the beginning, you have two kind of things to consider. That's the tie approach. We have different ties. And if you are tied up to people who have whatever, financial resources, social resources, relationship resources, experience resources, whatever resources, it's good. That's the resourceful alters in your network which provide you with social capital. And you have weak and strong ties. You have many, many people where you have weak ties. Just look at your Facebook account or whatever account. You have many, many people that are linked, that are weak ties, and you have strong ties, maybe your handful of real friends. The same thing is when we look at not your own network, but the configuration of the entire network, you have a structural approach. It can be very dense, having friends, very close network, that might produce social capital, or it can be full of holes, being efficient and effective and produce social capital. Another point to consider in social networks is the general tendency of social networks, how the lines are distributed. If we have in mind that the lines are distributed normally, would mean if I go out, ask 100 people, there are some people having nearly no contacts or a few contacts. A few people have many, many contacts, and the rest is in the middle. So I get a roughly normal distribution. Or is it the case that very few people have a lot of contacts and the rest doesn't have many contacts? That would be a very biased distribution, a very skewed distribution. That's unclear because nobody really knows how it works. There is a rule of thumb, I will come to that, but if you look at the differences, a virus spreads in the United States, the picture below, the network is normally distributed. It will spread like that. If the network is not normally distributed, if you have a skewed distribution, it will spread like that. So when we want to predict the spread of information, viruses, whatever in social networks, we need a general conclusion how the networks is actually configured, how many ties two people have, is it normally distributed or not. A general rule of thumb is, as larger the network we consider and we want to study is, as more it is skewed, it has a skewed distribution. The World Wide Web has a complete skewed distribution. There are a few with many, many links, and the rest has less links. And that will be with all larger networks of whatever kind we study that. As smaller a network gets, as more normally distributed it will get. So here are a few examples of, I think, quite appealing network research. What you see here that are the trading routes of Russia in the 12th, 13th century. And of course, at this time, trading, there were no ways, no motorways, no autobahns. There were rivers, and you traded on rivers. And of course, if I put it into a network picture, I could say, okay, what town has the most advantage? The town with a geodesic distance, with the shortest geodesic distance to all other towns, and that was the town 36, and that's Moscow. And it became an economic center. I mean, that is a research in hindsight, but also you might be using it for predicting economic developments in the future. Another example, it's patent data. And this patent data, of course, when you apply for a patent, you have to indicate former patents that you used for developing your patents. That's as reference. And you can use that for actually analyzing this network of all those patents and predict future technology. And that's already done. And there's also a lot of artificial intelligence involved with algorithm to develop that. I mean, you also have a lot of artificial intelligence and network analytics more and more go together. I mean, things develop over networks, and if you find smart algorithm in predicting network development, that's already going in the direction of artificial intelligence. That's not a big research, but it's a very famous one. thousands of times cited from other researchers. It shows a manufacturer and networks and manufacturers embedded. And it is arguing if you have too many suppliers and partners, you have very high transaction costs. It's not good for you. And if you only have one, it's not good for you because you will be blackmailed. So it is, let's say, the embeddedness of companies in a network of suppliers and other partners. It's important to consider when you make a strategic proposal to your company or a setup of a startup. Another example is stock exchange. As many people tell, the information we get change stock exchange rates or the fluctuation of values there. It's true, but only partly, because the insecurity at the stock exchange is so tremendously high that you have a lot of herd behavior there. So that if someone moves, even without any information, others will follow. So it's not per se the information, it's the behavior of single actors that cause the behavior of many more actors, and that also can be explained in social networks. Hot issues we were researching is users and innovation. We will come to this topic later in this series of lectures. We have studied technology transfer, we have studied alliances and corporations, and we have studied projects, teams, and leaderships. And I will go through these topics 2 to 4 shortly. Now, about transfer offices, we have studied the network of transfer offices, of the German transfer offices of all universities and applied universities. That are more than 400 when you study that, and you find clusters and similarities between them, so you actually can prove a series of contagions and proximity where clusters in the south are very similar, where clusters around Berlin are very similar, and cooperate and do things together. That's not very surprising, it's actually very intuitive research. We also have studied alliances and corporations. We have studied several large industrial corporations researching on certain topics. Here's the example of nanotechnology. More than 50 enterprises were into InnoCNT, a nanotechnology network in Germany. Nanotechnology is still a technology which is not really widespread in Germany. So we were actually 20 years ago, we were somehow in the lead in doing innovations, researching that, but actually other countries in Asia took that over easily in the last years. But we found out that a very good balance of weak and strong ties within this consortia, it's the best way of handling also competition and different interests of the partners in that network. We also studied interlocking directorates. Coming back, you remember, the Dutch banks on a slide in the beginning. That's a European network, that are the 380 biggest European enterprises and their interlocking directorates. And we were studying the financial crisis in 2007 to 2009, and it shows actually that countries as France and Germany were much more stable by having this interlocks and this cooperating, and at the same time competing companies in the same country but with the same people in an external board. Another big project we did was done in cooperation with the European Space Agency. That was a project done on research instruments gathering radiation from space, and one was placed on Earth that are low frequency array, that are 15,000 dishes at the border between Germany and the Netherlands, and this 15,000 dishes, to put it in simple words, simulate a quite big dish which cannot be built to capture this radiation and to say something about events that happens out there in space millions of years ago. The same was done with a space-based satellite, a research satellite, Herschel Space Observatory, which was gathering data for 3 years in space and had some tools to measure that. And we were actually asked, why do these projects always need longer than expected and cost more money by that? And I mean, we have very specialized research companies in Europe. We have research institutions. Normally behind every such project, there is a consortium of people and between 200 or 300 people at both projects. And they're clustered behind what they do, components. So when we take a product, you can break down the product into components and subcomponents, and this product components and subcomponents have interfaces. That was our approach in looking at it. So you have this project and this product, what is used, the satellite or this grounded-based dishes. And then you look at interfaces between these components and you actually look at how the people really interact. So you have a product network, which is more or less not a social network, but a network. And you have the social network of people exchanging information, communicating towards each other. And that's the product network. It's also called design structure matrix. And you see that one of this is a satellite, the social satellite had 26 components. And these components have some weak and strong interfaces. For instance, a strong interface, if you have a solar array and a battery in the satellite, that's a strong interface because the solar array directly feeds the battery. But a solar array and a measurement tool do not have any interface. They work more or less independently of each other. And we were measuring the real interaction structure of those people in strong communicational contact and weak communicational contact, which means talking weekly, talking monthly. Between the components or those groups behind it, the communication is not so intense. So we expect when they talk weekly, it's already quite strong, monthly is weak, and we did not consider talking less. So it's also a matter of definition how you actually shape and display and analyze social networks. That's a decision of researchers done. And we measured that at different phases. At the design phase, quite in the beginning of the project. This project ran partly up to 15 years and towards the end of the project. And the product network as design structure matrix as displayed here, of course changes. In the beginning you try to develop as independent as possible. That's also part of engineering design methods. And then later you integrate those parts. So the network of the product goes from quite weakly dense to more strongly dense in the end. Whereas the communication network kept quite strong from the beginning to the end. And you also can correlate these networks and you see that the network correlation between the product and the real network is rather small. It's 0.27, 0.25. Whereas the communication network is extremely stable, does not change much. And that's one reason why this project run out of time and costs more by doing so. These astronomers and people from physics, astrophysics, actually develop this product, this research tools on a very, very high qualitative level. You have a very intense community doing that and very specialized community doing that. But the thing is, they all know each other. They are all part of the same group. And this group, being part of this group, requires highly specialized knowledge. And therefore they are too close, they're very close to each other. And that forms a way that everything is discussed up to the detail and developed up to the maximum of quality. And that was the reason, by having only the small group, that everything takes longer and is more expensive. A solution would be to cooperate more internationally with China, with Russia, with Japan, with the United States, to have more mixing groups, not necessarily for the quality of the product, but maybe for the speed of the product development process. That is the suggested literature for this lecture, and thank you for listening, and we will see next time.